Part 2 of Chapter 2 of The Abandoned Room. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading done by Jules Harlock of Mississauga, Ontario, Canada. The Abandoned Room by Wadsworth Camp. Chapter 2, Section 2. He drew back from the window, pointing. The detective Howells had strolled into the court. His hands hung at his sides. They didn't swing as he walked. His lips were stretched in that thin, straight smile. He paused by the fountain, glancing for a moment anxiously downward. Then he came on and entered the house. "He'll be restless," Graham said, "until the coroner comes and proves or disproves his theory of murder. If he questions you, you'd better say nothing for the present. From his point of view, what you remember of last night would be only damaging." "I want him to leave me alone," Bobby said. "If he doesn't arrest me, I won't have him bullying me." Jenkins knocked and entered. The old butler was as white-faced as Bobby, more tremulous. "The policeman, sir. He's asking for you. Tell him I don't wish to see him." The detective himself stepped from the obscurity of the hall, smiling his queer smile. "Ah, you are here, Mr. Blackburn. I'd like a word with you." He turned to Graham and Jenkins. "Alone, if you please." Bobby mutely agreed, and Graham and the butler went out. The detective closed the door and leaned against it, studying Bobby with his narrow eyes. "I don't suppose," he began, "that there's any use asking you about your movements last night." "None," Bobby answered jerkily, "unless you arrest me and take me before those who ask questions with authority." The detective's smile widened. "No matter. I didn't come to argue with you about that. I was curious to know if you tried to see your grandfather's body." Bobby shook his head. "I took it for granted the room was locked." "Yes," the detective answered, "but some people, it seems, have skillful ways of overcoming locks." He moved to one side, placing his hand on the doorknob. "I've come to open doors for you, to give you the opportunity an affectionate grandson must crave." Bobby hesitated, fighting back his feeling of repulsion, his first instinct to refuse. The detective might take it as an evidence against him. On the other hand, if he went, the man would unquestionably try to tear from a meeting between the living and the dead some valuable confirmation of his theory. "Well," the detective said, "what's the matter?" "Thought the least I could do was to give you a chance." "Wouldn't do it for everybody." "Then everybody hasn't your affectionate nature," Bobby advanced. "For God's sake, stop mocking me. I'll go, since you wish." The detective opened the door and stood aside to let Bobby pass. "Dare say you know the room, the way to it." Bobby didn't answer. He went along the corridor and into the main hall where Katherine had met Silas Blackburn last night. He fought back his aversion and entered the corridor of the old wing. He heard the detective behind him. He was aware of the man's narrow eyes watching him with a malicious assurance. Bobby, with a feeling of discomfort, sprung in part from the gloomy passageway, paused before the door his grandfather had had the unaccountable whim of entering last night. The detective took a key from his pocket and inserted it in the lock. "Had some trouble repairing the lock this morning," he said. "That fellow, Jenkins, entered with a heavy hand, a good deal heavier than whoever was here before him." He opened the door. "Queerest case I've ever seen," he mumbled. "Step in, Mr. Blackburn." Because of the drawn blinds, the room was nearly as dark as the corridor. Bobby entered slowly, his nerves taut against the farther wall. The bed was like an enormous shadow without form. "Stay where you are," the detective warned, "until I give you more light. You know I wouldn't want you to touch anything, because the room is exactly as it was when he was murdered." Bobby experienced a swift impulse to strangle the brutal word in the detective's throat, but he stood still while the man went to the bureau, struck a match, and applied it to a candle. The wick burned reluctantly. It flickered in the wind that slipped past the curtains of the open window. "Come here," the detective commanded roughly. Bobby dragged himself forward until he stood at the foot of the four-poster bed. The detective lifted the candle and held it beneath the canopy. "You look all you want now, Mr. Robert Blackburn," he said grimly. Bobby conquered the desire to close his eyes, to refuse to obey. He stared at his grandfather, and a feeling of wonder grew upon him. For Silas Blackburn rested peacefully in the great bed. His eyes were closed. The thick grey brows were no longer gathered in the frown too familiar to Bobby. The face with its grey beard retained no fear, no record of a great shock. Bobby glanced at the detective, who bent over the bed, watching him out of his narrow eyes. "Why," he asked simply, "do you say he was murdered?" "He was murdered," the detective answered. "Murdered in cold blood. And look you here, young fellow. I know who did it. I'm going to strap that man in the electric chair. He's got just one chance. If he talks out. If he makes a clean breast of it." Across the body he bent closer. He held the candle so that its light searched Bobby's face instead of the dead man's, and the uncertain flame was like an ambush for his eyes. In response to those intolerable words, Bobby's sick nerves stretched too tight. No masquerade remained before this huntsman who had his victim trapped and calmly studied his agony. The horror of the accusation shot at him across the body of the man he couldn't be sure he had murdered, robbed him of his last control. He cried out hysterically, "Why don't you do something? For God's sakes, why don't you arrest me?" A chuckle came from the man in ambush behind the yellow flame. "Listen to the boy. What's he talking about? Grief for his grandfather? That's what it is. Grief." "Stop!" Bobby shouted. "It's what you've been accusing me with ever since you stopped me at the station." He indicated the silent form of the old man. "You keep telling me I murdered him. Why don't you arrest me then? Why don't you lock me up? Why don't you put the case on a reasonable basis?" He waited, trembling. The flame continued to flicker, but the hand holding the candlestick failed to move, and Bobby knew that the eyes didn't waver either. He forced his glance from the searching flame. He managed to lower and steady his voice. "You can't. That's the trouble. He wasn't murdered. The coroner will tell you so. Anybody who looks at him will tell you so. Since you haven't the nerve to arrest me, I'm going. I'm glad to have had this out with you. Understand, I'm my own master. I do what I please. I go where I please." At last the candle moved to one side. The detective straightened and walked to Bobby. The multitude of small lines in his face twitched. His voice was too cold for the fury of his words. "That's just what I wanted you to do. Damn you. Anything you please. I'm accusing nobody, but I'm getting somebody. I've got somebody right now for this old man's murder. My man's going to writhe and burn in the chair. Confession or no confession. Now get out of this room since you're so anxious, and don't come near it again." Bobby went. At the end of the corridor he heard the closing of the door, the scraping of the key. He was afraid the detective might follow him to his room to heckle him further. To avoid that, he hurried to the lower floor. He wanted to be alone. He must have time to accustom himself to this degrading fate which loomed in the too close future. Unless they could demolish the detective's theory, he, Bobby Blackburn, would go to the death house. A fire blazed in the big hall fireplace. Paredes stood with his back to it, smoking and warming his hands. A man sat in the shadow of a deep leather chair, his rough, unpolished boots stretched toward the flaming logs. As he came down the stairs, Bobby heard the heavy, rumbling voice of the man in the chair. "Certainly it's a queer case, but not the way Howells means. I dare say the old fool died what the world will call a natural death. If you smoke so much, you will, too, before long." Bobby tried to slip past, but Paredes saw him. "Feeling better, Bobby?" The boots were drawn in. From the depths of the chair arose a figure nearly gigantic in the firelight. The man's face, at first glance, appeared to be covered with hair, black and curling. It straggled over his forehead, it circled his mouth, and fell in an unkempt beard down his waistcoat. The huge man must have been as old as Silas Blackburn, but he showed no touch of grey. His only concession to age was the sunken and bloodshot appearance of his eyes. Bobby and Catherine had always been afraid of this great grim country practitioner who had attended their childish illnesses. That sense of an overpowering and incomprehensible personality had lingered. Even through his graver fear, Bobby felt a sharp discomfort as he surrendered his hand to the other's absorbing grasp. "I'm afraid you came too late this time, Dr. Groom." The doctor looked him up and down. "Not for you, I guess," he grumbled. "Don't you know you're sick, boy?" Bobby shook his head. "I'm very tired, that's all. I'm on my way to the library to try to rest." He freed his hand. The big man nodded approvingly. "I'll send you a dose," he promised. "And don't you worry about your grandfather's having been murdered by any man. I've seen the body. Stuff and nonsense. Detective's an ass. Waiting for coroner, although I know he's one too." "I pray," Bobby answered listlessly, "that you're right." "If there's any little thing I can do," Paredes offered formally. No, thanks," Bobby answered. He went on to the library. He glanced with an unpleasant shrinking from the door of the enclosed staircase leading to the private hall just outside the room in which his grandfather lay dead. There was no fire here, but he wrapped himself in a rug and lay on the broad, high-backed lounge which was drawn close to the fireplace, facing it. His complete weariness conquered his premonitions, his feelings of helplessness. The entrance of Jenkins barely aroused him. "Where are you, Mr. Robert?" "Here," Bobby answered sleepily. The butler walked to the lounge and looked over the back. "To be sure, sir. I didn't see you here." He held out a glass. "Dr. Groom said you were to drink this. It would make you sleep, sir." Bobby closed his eyes again. "Put it on the table where I can reach it when I want it." "Yes, sir, Mr. Robert." "The policeman. Did he say anything?" "If I might be so bold as to ask?" "Go away," Bobby groaned. "Leave me in peace." And peace for a little time came to him. It was the sound of voices in the rooms that aroused him. He lay for a while, scarcely knowing where he was, but little by little the sickening truth came back, and he realized that it was Graham and the detective, Howells, who talked close to the window, and Graham had already fulfilled his promise. Bobby didn't want to eavesdrop, but it was patent he would embarrass Graham by disclosing himself now, and it was likely Graham would be glad of a witness to anything the detective might say. It was still light. A ray from the low sun entered the window and rested on the door of the enclosed staircase. Graham's anxious demand was the first thing Bobby heard distinctly, the thing that warned him to remain secreted. I think now, with the coroner on his way, it's time you defined your suspicions a trifle more clearly. I am a lawyer. In a sense, I represent young Mr. Blackburn. Please tell me why you are so sure his grandfather was murdered." "All right," the detective's level voice came back. "Half an hour ago I would have said no again, but now I've got the evidence I wanted. I appreciate, Mr. Graham, that you're a friend of that young rascal, and what I have to say isn't pleasant for a friend to hear. But first, you want to know why I'm so sure the case is murder, in spite of the doctor who made his diagnosis without really looking." "Go on," Graham said softly. Bobby waited, his nerves as tense as they had grown in the presence of the dead man. "2 days ago," the detective went on quietly, "old Mr. Blackburn came to the courthouse in Smithtown and asked for the best detective the district attorney could put his hand on. I don't want to blow my own trumpet, but I've got away with 1 or 2 pretty fair jobs. I've had good offers from private firms in New York. So they turned him over to me. It was easy to see the old man was scared, just as his niece says he was last night. The funny part was he wouldn't say definitely what he was afraid of. I thought he might be shielding somebody until he was a little surer of his ground. He told me he was afraid of being murdered, and he wanted a good man he could call on to come out here to the Cedars if things got too hot for him. I can hear his voice now as distinctly as if he was standing where you are. 'My heart's all right,' he said. 'It won't stop a while yet unless it's made to. So if I'm found cold some fine morning, you can be sure I was put out of the way.' I tried to pump him, naturally, but he wouldn't say another word except that he'd send for me if there was time. He didn't want any fuss made, and he gave me a handsome present to keep my mouth shut and not to bother him with any more questions. I figured, you can't blame me, Mr. Graham, that the old boy was a little cracked, so I took his money and let it go at that. I didn't think much more about it until they told me early this morning he lay dead here under peculiar circumstances." "Odd," Graham commented. "It does make it more like murder, Howells. But he doesn't look like a murdered man. When you know as much about crime as I do, Mr. Graham, you'll realize that murders which are a long time planning are likely to take on one of 2 appearances: suicide or natural death." "All right," Graham said. "For the purpose of argument, let us agree it's murder. Even so, why do you suspect young Blackburn?" "Without a scrap of evidence, it's plain as the nose on your face," the detective answered. "If old Blackburn had lived until this morning, our young man would have been a pauper. As it is, he's a millionaire, but I don't think he'll enjoy his money. The 2 had been at sword's point for a long time. Robert hated the old man, never made any bones about it. You couldn't ask for a more damaging motive." "You can't convict a man on motive," Graham said shortly. "You spoke of evidence." "More," the detective replied, "than any jury in the land would ask." Bobby held his breath, shrinking from this information, which, however, he realized it was better he should know. "When I got here," the detective said, "I decided on the theory of murder to make a careful search as soon as day broke. I didn't have to wait for day, though, to find one crying piece of evidence. For a long time I was alone in the room with the body. Queer feeling about that room, Mr. Graham. Don't know how to describe it except to say it's uncomfortable. Too old, maybe. Maybe it was just being there alone with the dead men before the dawn, although I thought I was hardened to that sort of thing. Anyway, I didn't like it. To keep my spirits up as well as to save time, I commenced searching the place with a candle. Nothing about the bed, nothing in the closets or the bureau. He grinned sheepishly. You know, I kind of was afraid to open the closet doors. Then I got on my knees and looked under the bed. The light was bad, and I didn't see anything at first. After a minute, close against the wall, I noticed something white. I reached in and pulled it out. It was a handkerchief, and it had a monogram, Mr. Graham, R.B. in purple and green. He paused. Graham exclaimed sharply. Bobby felt the net tighten. If that evidence was conclusive to the others, how much more so was it for him? He recalled how, after awakening in the empty house, he had searched unsuccessfully in all his pockets for his handkerchief, intending to brush the dirt from his shoes. I went to his room, the detective hurried on, and found a lot of his clothes and his stationery and his toilet articles marked with the same cipher. I knew my man had made a big mistake, the sort of mistake every criminal makes no matter how clever he is, and I had him. But that isn't by any means all. Don't look so distressed, Mr. Graham. There isn't the slightest chance for him. You see, I repaired the lock, and as soon as it was day, closed the room and went outside to look for signs. Since nightfall, no one had come legitimately through the court except Dr. Groom and myself. Our footprints were all right, making a straight line along the path to the front door. In the soft earth by the fountain, I found another and a smaller print, made by a very neat shoe, sir, and I said to myself, there is almost certainly the footprint of the murderer. There were plenty of others coming across the grass. He evidently avoided the path, and there was one directly under the open window where the body lies. It's still there. Perhaps you can see it. No matter. That's the last one I found. The print ceased there. There wasn't a one going back, and I was fair up a stump. Then I saw a little undefined sign of pressure on the grass, and I got an idea. Suppose, I say, my man took his shoes off and went around in his stockinged feet. I couldn't understand, though, why he hadn't thought of that before. I went back to Robert Blackburn's room and got one of his shoes, and ran into a snag again. The sole of the shoe was a trifle larger than the footprints. Every one of his shoes I tried was the same way. I argued that the handkerchief was enough, but I wanted this other evidence. I simply had to clear up these queer footprints. I figured, since the murder had been made to look so much like a natural death, that he'd come out here sometime today, expecting to carry it off. I wanted to go to the station, anyway, to find out if he'd been seen coming through last night or early this morning. While I was talking to the station agent, I had my one piece of luck. I couldn't believe my eyes. Mr. Roberts walks up from the woods. He'd been hiding around the neighborhood all the time. Probably had missed his handkerchief and decided he'd better not take any chances. Yet it must have seemed a pretty sure thing that the station wouldn't be watched. And it's those nervy things, doing the obvious, that skillful criminals get away with all the time. I needed only one look at him, and I had the answer to the mystery of the footprints. I gave him plenty of time to come here and change his clothes. Then I maneuvered him out of his room and went there and found the pumps he'd worn last night and today. You see, they'd be a little smaller than his ordinary shoes. Not only did they fit the footprints exactly, but they were stained with soil exactly like that in the court. There you are, sir. I made a plaster cast of one of the prints. I've got it here in my pocket where I intend to keep it until I clear the whole case up and turn in my report." Graham's tone was shocked and discouraged. "What more do you want? Why haven't you arrested him?" In this room, the detective's satisfied chuckle was an offense. "No good detective would ask that, Mr. Graham. I want my report clean. The coroner will tell us how the old man was killed. I want to tell you how young Blackburn got into that room. One of the windows was raised a trifle, but that's no use. I figured on the outside of the wing until I'm dizzy. There's no way up for a normal man. An orangutan would make hard work of it. His latchkey would have let him into the house, and it would have been simple enough for him to find out that the old man had changed his room. I've got to find out how he got past those doors, locked on the inside." He chuckled again, almost like a sleepwalker's work. Bobby shivered. Was that where the evidence pointed? Already the net was too finely woven. The detective continued earnestly. "I'm figuring on some scheme to make him show me the way. I've sort of a plan for tonight, but it's only a chance." "What?" Graham asked. "Oh, no, sir." Howells laughed. "You'll learn about that when the time comes." "I don't understand you," Graham said. "You're sure of your man, but you keep no close watch on him. Do you know where he is now?" "Haven't the slightest idea, Mr. Graham." "What's to prevent his running away?" "I'm offering him every opportunity. He wouldn't get far, and I've a feeling that if he confessed by running, he'd break down and give up the whole thing. You've no idea how it frets me, Mr. Graham. I've got my man practically in the chair. But from a professional point of view, it isn't a pretty piece of work until I find out how he got in and out of that room. The thing seems impossible, and yet here we are, knowing that he did it. Well, maybe I'll find out tonight. Hello." The door opened. Bobby, from his hiding place, could see Paredes on the threshold, yawning and holding a cigarette in his fingers. "Here you are," he said drowsily. "I've just been in the court. It made me seek company. The court's too damp, Mr. Detective." His laugh was lackadaisical. "When the sun leaves it, the court seems full of unfriendly things, what the ignorant would call ghosts. I'm Spanish, and I know." The detective grunted. "Funny," Paredes went on. "Observation doesn't seem to interest you. I'd rather fancied it might." He yawned again and put his cigarette to his lips. Puffing placidly, he turned and left. "What do you suppose he means by that?" the detective said to Graham. Without waiting for an answer, he followed Paredes from the room. Graham went after him. Bobby threw back the rug and arose. For a moment he was as curious as the others as to Paredes' intention. He slipped across the dining room. The hall was deserted. The front door stood open. From the court came Paredes' voice, even, languid, wholly without expression. "Mean to tell me you don't react to the proximity of unaccountable forces here, Mr. Howells?" The detective's laugh was disagreeable. "You're trying to make a fool of me. That isn't healthy." As Bobby hurried across the hall and up the stairs, he heard Paredes answer. "You should speak to Dr. Groom. He says this place is too crowded by the unpleasant past." Bobby climbed out of hearing. He entered his bedroom and locked the door. He resented Paredes' words and attitude, which he defined as studied to draw humor out of a tragic and desperate situation. He thought of them in no other way. His tired mind dismissed them. He threw himself on the bed, muttering, "If I run away, I'm done for. If I stay, I'm done for." He took a fierce, twisted joy in one phase of the situation. "If I was there last night," he thought, Howells will never find out how I got into the room, because no matter what trap he sets, I can't tell him." His leaden weariness closed his eyes. For a few minutes he slept again. Once more it was a voice that awakened him, this time a woman's, raised in a scream. He sprang up, flung open the door, and stumbled into the corridor. Katherine stood there, holding her dressing gown about her with trembling hands. The face she turned to Bobby was white and panic-stricken. She beckoned, and he followed her to the main hall. The others came tearing up the stairs: Graham, Paredes, the detective, and the black and gigantic doctor. In answer to their quick questions, she whispered breathlessly, "I heard. It was just like last night. It came across the court and stole in at my window." She shook. She stretched out her hands in a terrified appeal. Something moved in that room where he's dead." "Nonsense," the detective said. "Both doors are locked, and I have the keys in my pocket." Paredes fumbled with a cigarette. "You're forgetting what I said about my sensitive apprehension of strange things." The detective interrupted him loudly, confidently. "I tell you the room is empty except for the murdered man, unless someone's broken down a door." Katherine cried out, "No, I heard the same stirring. Something moved in there." The detective turned brusquely and entered the old corridor. "We'll see." The others followed. Katherine was close to Bobby. He touched her hand. "He's right, Katherine. No one's there. No one could have been there. You mustn't give way like this. I'm depending on you, on your faith." She pressed his hand, but her assurance didn't diminish. The key scraped in the lock. They crowded through the doorway after the detective. He struck a match and lighted the candle. He held it over the bed. He sprang back with a sharp cry, unlike his level quality, his confident conceit. He pointed. They all approximated his helpless gesture, his blank amazement, for on the bed had occurred an abominable change. The body of Silas Blackburn no longer lay peacefully on its back. It had been turned on its side and remained in a stark and awkward attitude. For the first time the back of the head was disclosed. Their glances focused there, on the tiny round hole at the base of the brain, on the pillow where the head had rested, and which they saw now was stained with an ugly and irregular splotch of blood. Bobby saw the candle quiver at last in the detective's hand. The man strode to the door leading to the private hall and examined the lock. "Both doors," he said, "were locked. There was no way in." He turned to the others, spreading his hands in justification. The candle, which he seemed to have forgotten, cast gross moving shadows over his face and over the face of the dead man. "At least you'll all grant me now that he was murdered." They continued to stare at the body of Silas Blackburn. Cold for many hours, it was as if he had made this atrocious revealing movement to assure them that he had, indeed, been murdered, to expose to their startled eyes the sly and deadly method. End of Chapter 2, Section 2 of The Abandoned Room.
Chapter 3, Part 1 of The Abandoned Room. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ashley Jane. The Abandoned Room by Wadsworth Camp. Chapter 3, Part 1. Howells delivers himself to the abandoned room. For a long time no one spoke. The body of Silas Blackburn had been alone in a locked room, yet before their eyes it lay, turned on its side as if to inform them of the fashion of this murder. The tiny hole at the base of the brain, the blood stain on the pillow which the head had concealed, offered their mute and ghastly testimony. Dr. Groom was the first to relax. He raised his great hairy hand to the bedpost and grasped it. His rumbling voice lacked its usual authority, vibrated with a childish wonder. "I remember that it isn't the first time there's been blood from a man's head on that pillow." Katherine nodded. "What do you mean?" the detective snarled. "There's only one answer to this. There must have been a mechanical post-mortem reaction." For a moment Dr. Groom's laugh filled the old room. It ceased abruptly. "Don't be a fool, Mr. Policeman. At the most conservative estimate this man has been dead for more than 13 hours. Even a few instants after death the human body is incapable of any such reaction." "What then?" the detective asked. "Some one of us, one of the servants, must have overcome the locks again and deliberately disturbed the body. That must be so, but I don't get the motive." "It isn't so," Dr. Groom answered bluntly. Already the detective had to a large extent controlled his bewilderment. "I'd like your theory, then," he said dryly. "You and Mr. Paredes have already been gossiping about the supernatural. When you first came you hinted dark things. You said he'd probably died what the world would call a natural death." "I meant," the doctor answered, "only that Mr. Blackburn's heart might have failed under the impulse of a sudden fright in this room. I also said, you remember, that the room was nasty and unhealthy. Plenty of people have remarked it before me." Graham touched the detective's arm. "A little while ago you admitted yourself that the room was uncomfortable." Dr. Groom smiled. The detective faced him with a fierce belligerency. "You'll agree he was murdered?" "Certainly, if you wish to call it that. But I asked for the sharp instrument that caused death. I want to know how, while Blackburn lay on his back, it was inserted through the bed, the springs, the mattress, and the pillow." "What are you driving at?" Dr. Groom pointed to the dead man. "I merely repeat that this isn't the first time that pillow's been stained from unusual wounds in the head. Being, as you call it, a trifle superstitious, I merely ask if the coincidence is significant." Katherine cried out. Bobby, in spite of his knowledge that sooner or later he would be arrested for his grandfather's murder, stepped forward, nodding. "I know what you mean, Doctor." "Anybody," the doctor said, "who's ever heard of this house knows what I mean. We needn't talk of that." The detective, however, was insistent. Paredes, in his unemotional way, expressed an equal curiosity. Bobby and Katherine had been frightened as children by the stories clustering about the old wing. They nodded from time to time while the doctor held them in the desolate room with the dead man, speaking of the other deaths as it had sheltered. Silas Blackburn's great-grandfather, he told the detective, had been carried to that bed from a Revolutionary skirmish with a bullet at the base of his brain. For many hours he had raved deliriously, fighting unsuccessfully against the final silence. 'Tis been a legend in the family, as these young people will tell you, that Blackburns die hard, and there are those who believe that people who die hard leave something behind them, something that clings to the physical surroundings of their suffering. If it was only that one case! But it goes on and on. Silas Blackburn's father, for instance, killed himself here. He'd lost his money in silly speculations. He stood where you stand, detective, and blew his brains out. He fell over and lay where his son lies, his head on that pillow. Silas Blackburn was a money grubber. He started with nothing but this property, and he had made a fortune, but even he had enough imagination to lock this room up after one more death of that kind. It was this girl's grandfather. You were too young, Katherine, to remember it, but I took care of him. I saw it. He was carried here after he had been struck at the back of the head in a polo match. He died, too, fighting hard. God, how that man suffered! He loosened his bandages toward the end. When I got there the pillow was redder than it is today. It strikes me as curious that the first time the room has been slept in since then it should harbor a death behind locked doors, from a wound in the head." Paredes's fingers were restless, as if he missed his customary cigarette. The detective strolled to the window. "Very interesting," he said. "Extremely interesting for old women and young children. You may classify yourself, Doctor." "Thanks," the doctor rumbled. "I'll wait until you've told me how these doors were entered, how that wound was made, how this body turned on its side in an empty room." The detective glanced at Bobby. His voice lacked confidence. "I'll do my best. I'll even try to tell you why the murderer came back this afternoon to disturb his victim." Bobby went, curiously convinced that the doctor had the better of the argument. For a moment Katherine, Graham, Paredes and he were alone in the main hall. "God knows what it was," Graham said, "but it may mean something to you, Bobby. Tell us carefully, Katherine, about the sounds that came to you across the court." "It was just what I heard last night when he died," she answered. "It was like something falling softly, then a long-drawn sigh. I tried to pay no attention. I fought it. I didn't call at first, but I couldn't keep quiet. I knew we had to go to that room. It never occurred to me that the detective or the coroner might be there moving around." "You were alone up here?" Graham said. "I think so." "No," Bobby said. "I was in my room." "What were you doing?" Graham asked. "I was asleep. Katherine's call woke me up." "Asleep?" Paredes echoed. "And she didn't call at once—" He broke off. Bobby grasped his arm. "What are you trying to do?" "I'm sorry," Paredes said. "Now really you mustn't think of that. I shouldn't have spoken. I'm more inclined to agree with the doctor's theory, impossible as it seems." "Yesterday," Katherine said, "I would have thought it impossible. After last night and just now I'm not so sure. I wish the doctor were right. It would clear you, Bobby." He smiled. "Do you think any jury would listen to such a theory?" Katherine put a finger to her lips. Howells and the doctor came from the corridor of the old wing. At the head of the stairs the detective turned. "You will find it very warm and comfortable by the fire in the lower hall, Mr. Blackburn." He waited until Katherine had slipped to her room, until Graham, Paredes, the doctor, and Bobby were on the stairs. Then he walked slowly into the new corridor. Bobby knew what he was after. The detective had made no efforts to disguise his intention. He wanted Bobby out of the way while he searched his room again, this time for a sharp, slender instrument capable of penetrating between the bones at the base of a man's brain. Paredes lighted a cigarette and warmed his back at the fire. The doctor settled himself in his chair. He paid no attention to the others. He wouldn't answer Paredes's slow remarks. "Interesting, Doctor. I am a little psychic. Always in this house I have responded to strange, unfriendly influences. Always, as now, the approach of night depresses me." Bobby couldn't sit still. He nodded at Graham, arose, got his coat and hat, and stepped into the court. The dusk was already thick there. Dampness and melancholy seemed to exude from the walls of the house. He paused and gazed at one of the footprints in the soft earth by the fountain. Shreds of plaster adhered to the edges, testimony that the detective had made his cast from this print. He tried to realize that that mute, familiar impression had the power to send him to his execution. Graham, who had come silently from the house, startled him. "What are you looking at?" "No use, Hartley. I was on the library lounge. I heard every word Howells said." "Perhaps it's just as well," Graham said. "You know what you face, but I hate to see you suffer. We've got to find a way around that evidence." Bobby pointed to the windows of the room of death. "There's no way around except the doctor's theory." He laughed shortly. "Much as I feared that room, I'm afraid the psychic explanation won't hold water. Paredes put his finger on it. I would have had time to get back to my room before Katherine called—" "Stop, Bobby!" "Hartley, I'm afraid to go to sleep. It's dreadful not to know whether you are active in your sleep, whether you are evil and ingenious to the point of the miraculous in your sleep. I'm so tired, Hartley." "Why should you have gone to that room this afternoon?" Graham asked. "You must get this idea out of your head. You must have sleep and perhaps when you're thoroughly rested you will remember." "I'm not so sure," Bobby said, "that I want to remember." He pointed to the footprint. "There's no question. I was here last night." "Unless," Graham said, "your handkerchiefs and your shoes were stolen." "Nonsense!" Bobby cried. "The only motive would be to commit murder in order to kill me by sending me to the chair. And who would know his way around that dark house like me? Who would have found out so easily that my grandfather had changed his room?" "It's logical," Graham admitted slowly, "but we can't give in. By the way, has Paredes ever borrowed any large sums?" Bobby hesitated. After all, Paredes and he had been good friends. "A little here and there," he answered reluctantly. "Has he ever paid you back?" "I don't recall," Bobby answered, flushing. "You know I've never been exactly calculating about money. Whenever he wanted it I was always glad to help Carlos out." "Why do you ask?" "If any one," Graham answered, "looked on you as a certain source of money, there would be a motive in conserving that source, in increasing it. Probably lots of people knew Mr. Blackburn was out of patience with you. Would make a new will to day." "Do you think," Bobby asked, "that Carlos is clever enough to have got through those doors? And what about this afternoon, that ghastly disturbing of the body?" He smiled wanly. "It looks like me or the ghosts of my ancestors." "If Paredes," Graham insisted, "tries to borrow any money from you now, tell me about it. Another thing, Bobby, we can't afford to keep your experiences of last night a secret any longer." He stepped to the door and asked Doctor Groom to come out. "He won't be likely to pass your confidences on to Howells," he said. "Those men are natural antagonists." After a moment the doctor appeared, a slouch hat drawn over his shaggy forehead. "What do you want?" he grumbled. "This court's a first-class place to catch cold. Dampest hole in the neighborhood. Often wondered why." "I want to ask you," Graham began, "something about the effects of such drugs as could be given in wine. Tell him, will you, Bobby, what happened last night?" Bobby vanquished the discomfort with which the gruff, opinionated physician had always filled him. He recited the story of last night's dinner, of his experience in the cafe, of his few blurred impressions of the swaying vehicle and the woods. "Hartley thinks something may have been put in my wine." "What for?" the doctor asked. "What are these people to gain by drugging you? Suppose for some far-fetched reason they wanted to have Silas Blackburn put out of the way. They couldn't make you do it by drugging you. At any rate, they couldn't have had a hand in this afternoon. Mind, I'm not saying you had a thing to do with it yourself, but I don't believe you were drugged. Any drug likely to be used in wine would probably have sent you into a deep sleep. And your symptoms on waking up are scarcely sharp enough. Sorry, boy. Sounds more like aphasia. The path you've been treading sometimes leads to that black country, and it's there that hate's sharp and unknown. I remember a case where a tramp returned and killed a farmer who had refused him food. Retained no recollection of the crime. Hours dropped out of his life. They executed him while he still tried to remember." "I read something about the case," Bobby muttered. "Been better if we hadn't," the doctor grumbled. "Suggestions work in a man's brain without his knowing it." He thought for a moment, his heavy black brows coming close together. He glanced at the windows of the old room, his sunken, infused eyes nearly closed. "I know how you feel, and that's a little punishment maybe you deserve. I'll say this for your comfort. You probably followed the plan that had been impressed on your brain by Mr. Graham. You came here, no doubt, and stood around. With an automatic appreciation of your condition, you may have taken that old precaution of convivial men returning home, and removed your shoes. Then your automatic judgment may have warned you that you weren't fit to go in at all, and probably wandered off to the empty house." "Then," Bobby asked, "you don't think I did it?" "God knows who did it. God knows what did it. The longer I live, the surer I become that we scientists can't probe everything. Whenever I go near Silas Blackburn's body, I receive a very powerful impression that his death in that room from such a wound goes deeper than ordinary murder, deeper than a case of recurrent aphasia." His eyes widened. He turned with Graham and Bobby at the sound of an automobile coming through the woods. "Probably the coroner at last," he said. The automobile, a small runabout, drew up at the entrance to the court. A little wizened man with yellowish skin stretched across his high cheekbones stepped out and walked up the path. "Well," he said shrilly, "what you doing, Doctor Groom?" "Waiting to witness another reason why coroners should be abolished," the doctor rumbled. "This is a dead man's grandson, Coroner, and Mr. Graham, a friend of the family's." Bobby accepted the coroner's hand with distaste. "Howells," the coroner said in his squeaky voice, "seems to think it's a queer case. Inconvenient, I call it. Wish people wouldn't die queerly whenever I go on a little holiday. I'd got 5 ducks, gentlemen, when they came to me with that damned telegram. Bad business, mind, 'cause people will die when you least expect them to. Let's go see what Howells has got on his mind. Bright sleuth, Howells. Ought to be in New York." He started up the path side by side with Doctor Groom. "Are you coming?" Graham asked Bobby. Bobby shook his head. "I don't want to. I'd rather stay outside. You'd better be there, Hartley." Graham followed the others while Bobby wandered from the court and started down a path that entered the woods from the rear of the house. Immediately the forest closed greedily about him. Here and there, where the trees were particularly stunted, branches cut against a pallid greenish glow in the west, the last light. Bobby wanted, if he could, to find that portion of the woods where he had stood last night, fancying the trees, straining in the wind like puny men, visualizing a dim figure in a black mask which he had called his conscience. The forest was all of a pattern, ugly, unfriendly, melancholy. He went on, however, hoping to glimpse that particular picture he remembered. He left the path, walking at haphazard among the undergrowth. Ahead he saw a placid, flat, and faintly luminous stretch. He pushed through the bushes and paused on the shore of a lake, small and stagnant. Dead, stripped trunks of trees protruded from the water. At the end a bird arose with a sudden flapping of wings. It cried angrily as it soared above the trees and disappeared to the south. The morbid loneliness of the place touched Bobby's spirit with chill hands. As a child he had never cared to play about the stagnant lake, nor, he recalled, had the boys of the village fished or bathed there. Certainly he hadn't glimpsed it last night. He was about to walk away when a movement on the farther bank held him, made him gaze with eager eyes across the sleepy water. He thought there was something black in the shadows of the trees, a thing that stirred through the heavy dusk without sound. He received, moreover, an impression of anger and haste as distinct as the bird had projected. But he could see nothing clearly in this bad light. He couldn't be sure that there was any one over there. He started around the edge of the lake, and for a moment he thought that the shape of a woman clothed in black detached itself from the shadow. The image dissolved. He wondered if it had been more substantial than fancy. "Who is that?" he called. The woods muffled his voice. There was no answer, nor was there, he noticed, any crackling of twigs or rustling of dead leaves. If there had been a woman there she had fled noiselessly. Yet, as he went on around, his own progress was distinctly audible through the decay of autumn. It was too dark on the other side to detect any traces of a recent human presence in the thicket. He couldn't quiet, however, the feeling that he had had a glimpse of a woman clothed in black who had studied him secretly across the stagnant stretch of the lake. On the other hand, there was no logic in a woman's presence here at such an hour, no logic in a stranger's running away from him. While he pondered, the night invaded the forest completely, making it impossible for him to search farther. It had grown so dark, indeed, that he found his way out with difficulty. The branches caught at his clothing, the underbrush tangled itself about his feet. It was as if the thicket were trying to hold him away from the house. As he entered the court, he noticed a discoloured glow diffusing itself through the curtains of the room of death. End of Chapter 3, Section 1. Recording by Ashley Jane. Part 2 of The Abandoned Room. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ashley Jane. The Abandoned Room by Wadsworth Camp. Chapter 3, Part 2. Howells delivers himself to the abandoned room. He opened the front door. Paredes and Graham alone sat by the fire. "Then they're not through yet," Bobby said. Graham arose. He commenced to pace the length of the hall. "They've had Katherine in that room. One would think she's been through enough. Now they've sent for the servants." Paredes laughed lightly. "After this," he said, "I'm afraid, Bobby, you'll need the powers of the police to keep servants in your house." Muttering, frightened voices came from the dining room. Jenkins entered and, shaking his head, went up the stairs. The two women who followed him were in tears. They paused as if seeking an excuse to linger on the lower floor, to postpone as long as possible their entrance of the room of death. Ella, a pretty girl whose dark hair and eyes suggested a normal vivacity, spoke to Bobby. "It's outrageous, Mr. Robert. He found out all we knew this morning. What's he after now? You might think we had murdered Mr. Blackburn." Jane was older. An ugly scar crossed her cheek. It was red and like an open wound as she demanded that Bobby put a stop to these inquisitions. "I can do nothing," he said. "Go on up and answer, or they can make trouble for you." Muttering again to each other, they followed Jenkins, and in the lower hall the three men waited. Jenkins came down first. His face was white. It twitched. "The body," he mouthed. "It moved. I saw it before." He stretched out his hands to Bobby. "That's why they wanted us, to find out where we were this afternoon and everything we've done, as if we might have gone there and disturbed—" Angry voices in the upper hall interrupted him. The two women ran down, as white as Jenkins. At an impatient nod from Bobby, the three servants went on to the kitchen. Howells, the coroner, and Dr. Groom descended. "What ails you, Doctor?" the coroner was squeaking. "I agree it's an unpleasant room. Lots of old rooms are. I follow you when you say no post-mortem contraction would have caused such an alteration in the position of the body. There's no question about the rest of it. The man was clearly murdered with a sharp tool of some sort, and the murderer was in the room again this afternoon and disturbed the corpse. Howells says he knows who. It's up to him to find out how. He says he has plenty of evidence and that the guilty person's in the house. So I'm not fretting myself. I'm cross with you, Howells, for breaking up my holiday. One of my assistants would have done as well." Howells apparently paid no attention to the coroner. His narrow eyes followed the doctor with a growing curiosity. His level smile seemed to have drawn his lips into a line, inflexible, a little cruel. The doctor grunted. "Instead of abolishing coroners, we ought to double their salaries." The coroner made a long squeak as an indication of mirth. "You think unfriendly spooks did it? I've always believed you were an old fogey." "Hanged if that doesn't sound modern." The doctor ran his fingers through his thick, untidy hair. "I merely ask for the implement that caused death. I only ask to know how it was inserted through the bed while Blackburn lay on his back. And if you've time you might tell me how the murderer entered the room last night and today." The coroner repeated his squeak. He glanced at the little group by the fire. "Out in the kitchen, upstairs, or right here under our noses is almost certainly the person who could tell us. Interesting case, Howells." Howells, who still watched the doctor, answered dryly, "Unusually interesting." The coroner struggled into his coat. "Permits are all available," he squeaked. "Have your undertakers out when you like." Graham answered him brusquely. "Everything's arranged. I've only to telephone." The coroner nodded at Dr. Groom. His voice pointed its humor with a thinner tone. "If I were you, Howells, I'd take this hairy old theorist up as a suspicious character." The doctor made a movement in his direction, while Howells continued to stare. The doctor checked himself. He went to the closet and got his hat and coat. "Want me to drop you, old sawbones?" the coroner asked. Savagely the doctor shook his head. "My buggy's in the stable." The coroner's squeak was thinner and more irritating than ever. "Then don't let the spooks get you, driving through the woods. Old folks say there are plenty there." Bobby arose. He couldn't face the prospect of the man squeaking again. "We find nothing to laugh at in this situation," he said. "You're quite through?" The coroner's eyes blazed. "I'm through, if that's the way you feel. Good night," he added with a sharp maliciousness. "I leave my sympathy for whoever Howells has his eagle eye on." Howells, when the doctor and the coroner had gone, excused himself with a humility that mocked the others. "With your permission I shall write in the library until dinner." He bowed and left. "He wants to work on his report," Graham suggested. "An exceptional man," Paredes murmured. "Has he questioned you?" Graham asked. "I'd scarcely call it that," Paredes replied. "We've both questioned and we've both been clams. I fancy he doesn't think much of me since I believe in ghosts, yet the doctor seems to interest him." "Where were you," Graham asked, "when Miss Perrine's scream called us?" Paredes stifled a yawn. "Dozing here by the fire. I'm very tired after last night." "You don't look particularly tired." "Custom, I'm ashamed to say, constructs a certain armor. Tomorrow, with a fresh mind, I hope to be able to dissect all I have seen and heard, all that has happened here today." "The thing that counts is what happened to me last night, Carlos," Bobby said. "It's the only way you can help me." As Paredes strolled to the foot of the stairs, Bobby waited for a defensive reply, for a sign, perhaps, that the Panamanian was offended and proposed to depart. Paredes, however, went upstairs yawning. He called back, "I must make myself a trifle more presentable for dinner." Graham faced Bobby with the old question. "What can he want hanging around here unless it's money?" And after a moment, "He's clever, hard to sound. I have to leave you, Bobby. I must telephone, the ugly formalities." "It's good of you to take them off my mind," Bobby answered. He remained in his chair, gazing drowsily at the fire, trying, always trying to remember, yet finding no new light among the shadows of his memory. Just before dinner Katherine joined him. She wore a somber gown that made her face seem too white, that heightened the groping curiosity of her eyes. Without speaking she sat down beside him and stared too at the smouldering fire. From her presence, from her tactful silence he drew comfort, to an extent rest. "You make me ashamed," he whispered once. "I've been a beast leaving you here alone these weeks. You don't understand quite why that was." She wouldn't let him go on. She shook her head. They remained silently by the fire until Graham and Paredes joined them. When dinner was announced, the detective came from the library and uninvited sat at the table with them. His report evidently still filled his mind, for he spoke only when it was unavoidable, and then in monosyllables. Paredes alone ate with a show of enjoyment, alone attempted to talk. Eventually even he fell silent before the lack of response. Afterward he arranged a small card table by the fire in the hall. He found cards, and with a package of cigarettes and a box of matches convenient to his hand, commenced to play solitaire. The detective, Bobby gathered, had brought his report up to date, for he lounged near by, watching the Panamanian's slender fingers as they handled the cards deftly. Bobby, Graham, and Katherine were glad to withdraw beyond the range of those narrow, searching eyes. They entered the library and closed the door. Graham, expectant of a report from his man in New York as to the movements of Maria and the identity of the stranger, was restless. "If we could only get one fact," he said, "one reasonable clue that didn't involve Bobby. I've never felt so at sea. I wonder if, in spite of Howell's evidence, we're not all a little afraid since this afternoon of something such as Katherine felt last night, something we can't define. Howells alone is satisfied. We must believe in the hand of another man. Dr. Groom talks about indefinable hands." "Uncle Silas was so afraid last night," Katherine whispered. "That," Bobby cried, "is a fact we must have." He paused. "What's that?" he asked sharply. They sat for some time listening to the sound of wheels on the gravel, to the banging of the front door, and later to the pacing of men in the room of death overhead. They tried again to thread the mazes of this problem whose only conceivable exit led to Bobby's guilt. The movements upstairs persisted. At last they became measured and dragging, like the footsteps of men who carried some heavy burden. They looked at each other then. Katherine hid her eyes. "It's like a tomb here," Bobby said. He arranged kindling in the fireplace and touched the match to it. It hadn't occurred to him to ring for Jenkins. None of them wished to be disturbed. Eventually it was the detective who intruded. He strolled in, glanced at them curiously for a moment, then walked to the door of the enclosed staircase. He grasped the knob. "Tonight," he announced, "I'm trying a small experiment on the chance of clearing up the last details of the mystery. Since it depends on the courage of whoever murdered Mr. Blackburn, I've small hope of its success." He indicated the ceiling. "You've heard, I dare say, what's been going on up there. Mr. Blackburn's body has been removed to his own room. The room where he was killed is empty. I mean to go up and enter and lock the doors as he did last night. I shall leave the window up as it was last night. I shall blow out the candle as he did." He lowered his voice. He looked directly at Bobby. His words carried a definite challenge. "I shall lie on the bed and await the murderer under the precise conditions Mr. Blackburn did." "What do you expect to gain by that?" Graham asked. "Probably nothing," Howells answered, "because, as I have said, success depends upon the courage of a man who kills in the dark while his victim sleeps. I simply give him the chance to attack me as he did Mr. Blackburn. Of course he realizes it would be a good deal to his advantage to have me out of the way. I ask him to come, therefore, as stealthily as he did last night. I beg him to match his skill with mine. I want him to play his miracle with the window or one of the locks. But I'll wager he hasn't the nerve. Although I don't see why he should hesitate. He's a doomed man. I shall make my arrest in the morning. I shall publish all my evidence." Bobby wouldn't meet the narrow, menacing eyes, for he knew that Howells challenged him to a duel of slyness with the whole truth at stake. The detective's manner increased the hatred which had blazed in Bobby's mind when he had stood in the bedroom over his grandfather's body. For a moment he whispered with all his heart that he might accept the challenge. He did the best he could. "I gather," he said, "that you haven't unearthed the motive for disturbing the body. And have you found the sharp instrument that caused death?" The detective answered tolerantly. "I have found a number of sharp instruments. None of them, however, seem quite slender or rough enough. I'll get all that out of my man when I lock him up. I'll get it tonight if he dares come." "Why," Graham said, "do you announce your plans so accurately to us?" The detective's level smile widened. "You shouldn't ask that, Mr. Graham. I've caused the servants to know my plans. Mr. Paredes knows them. I wish everyone in the house to know them. That is, in order that the murderer who is in the house may come if he wishes." Katherine arose abruptly. "When you come down to it," she said, "you are accusing one of us. It's brutal, unfair, absurd." "I am a detective, miss," Howells answered. "I have my own methods." Bobby stared at the slight protuberance in the breast pocket of the detective's coat. The cast of his footprint must be secreted there, and almost certainly the handkerchief which had been found beneath the bed. He shrank from his own thoughts. If he had consciously committed this murder, he could understand a desire to get that evidence. Katherine had gone closer to the detective. "In any case," she urged him, "I wish you wouldn't try to spend the night in that room. It isn't pleasant. After what the doctor has said, it isn't safe." Howells burst out laughing. "Never fear, miss. I am content to give Doctor Groom's spirits as much chance to take a fall out of me as anybody. I'll be going up now." He bowed. "Good night to you all, and pleasant dreams." He opened the door and slipped into the darkness of the private staircase. They heard him after he had closed the door climbing upward. Katherine shivered. "He has plenty of courage, Hartley. If nothing happens to him tonight, he'll finish Bobby in the morning. That mustn't happen. He mustn't go to jail. You understand. Things would never be the same for him again." Graham spread his hands. "What am I to do? I might go to New York and get after these people myself." "Don't leave the Cedars," Bobby begged, "until he does arrest me. There'll be plenty of time for the New York end then. I've no faith in it. Watch Carlos if you want, but most important of all, find out somehow you've got to find out what my grandfather was afraid of." Graham nodded. "And if it does come to an arrest, Bobby, you're not to say a word to anybody without my advice. You ought to go to bed now. You must have rest, and Katherine, too. Don't listen tonight, Katherine, for messages from across the court." "I'll try," she said. "But, Hartley, I wish that man wasn't there. I wish no one was in that room." She took Bobby's hand. "Good night, Bobby, and don't give up hope. We'll do something. Somehow we'll pull you through." Bobby waited, hoping that Graham would offer to share his room with him, for, as he had said earlier, the prospect of going to sleep, of losing control of his thoughts and actions, appalled him. Yet such an offer, he realized, must impress Graham as delicate as an indication that he really doubted Bobby's innocence, as a sort of spying. He wasn't surprised, therefore, when Graham only said, "I'll be in the next room, Bobby. If you're restless or need me, you've only to knock on the wall." Bobby didn't leave the library with them. The warmth with which Katherine had just filled him faded as he watched her go out side by side with Graham. Her hand was on Graham's arm. There was, he fancied, in her eyes an emotion deeper than gratitude or friendship. He sighed as the door closed behind them. He was himself largely to blame for that situation. His very revolt against its imminence had hastened its shaping. He walked anxiously to the table. He had remembered the medicine Dr. Groom had prepared for him that afternoon to make him sleep. He hadn't taken it then. If it remained where he had left it, which was likely enough in the disordered state of the household, he would drink it now. Reinforced by his complete weariness, it ought to send him into a sleep profound enough to drown any possible abnormal impulses of unconsciousness. The glass was there. He drained it, and stood for a time looking at the pinkish sediment in the bottom. That was all right for tonight, but afterward he couldn't shrink perpetually from sleep. He shrugged his shoulders, remembering it would make little difference what he did in his sleep when they had him behind prison bars. Perhaps this would be his last night of freedom. He found Paredes still in the hall. The Panamanian, with languid gestures, continued to play his solitaire. His box of cigarettes was much reduced. "I thought you were tired, Carlos." Paredes glanced up. His eyes were neither wary nor alert. As usual, his expression disclosed nothing of his thoughts, yet he must have read in Bobby's tone a reproach at this indifference. "The game intrigues me," he murmured. "And you know," he added dreamily, "I sometimes think better while I amuse myself." Bobby nodded good night and went on up to his room. Even while he undressed, the effects of the doctor's narcotic were perceptible. His eyes had grown heavy, his brain a trifle numb. Almost apathetically, he assured himself that he couldn't accomplish these mad actions in his sleep. "Yet last night," he murmured, "that finishes me in the eyes of the law. The doctor will testify to aphasia. According to him, I am two men. Two men!" He yawned, recalling snatches of books he had read and one or two scientific reports of such cases. He climbed into bed and blew out his candle. His drowsiness thickened. In his dulled mind one recollection remained, the picture of Howells coldly challenging him with his level smile to make a secret entrance of the old bedroom in a murderous effort to escape the penalty of the earlier crime. And Howells had been right. His death would give Bobby a chance. The destruction of the evidence, the bringing into the case of a broader-minded man, a man without carefully constructed theory, all that would help Bobby, might save him. Howells, moreover, had indicated that he had so far withheld his evidence, but that was probably a bait. In his drowsy way, Bobby hated more powerfully than before this detective who, with a serene malevolence, made him writhe in his net. Thought ceased. He drifted into a trance-like sleep. He swung in the black pit again, fighting out against crushing odds. The darkness thundered as though informing him that graver forces than any he had imagined had definitely grasped him. Then he understood. He was in a black cell, and the thundering was a steady advance of men along an iron floor to take him. "Bobby! Bobby!" He flung out his hands. He sat upright, opening his eyes. The blackness assumed the familiar, yielding quality of the night. The thunder, the footfalls, became a hurried knocking at his door. "Bobby, you're there!" It was Katherine. Her tone made the night as frightening as the blackness of the pit. "What's the matter?" "You're there. I didn't know. Get up. Hartley's putting some clothes on. Hurry. The house is so dark, so strange." "Tell me what happened." She didn't answer at first. He struck a match, lighting his candle, threw on a dressing gown, and stepped to the door. Katherine shrank against the wall, hiding her eyes from the light of his candle. He thought it odd she would wear the dress in which she had appeared at dinner, but it seemed indifferently fastened, and her hair was in disorder. Graham stepped from his room. "What is it?" Bobby demanded. "You wouldn't wake up, Bobby. You were so hard to wake." The idea seemed to fill her mind. She repeated it several times. "It's nothing," Graham said. "Go back to your room, Katherine. She's fanciful." She lowered her hands. Her eyes were full of terror. "No, we have to go to that room as I went last night, as we went today." Graham tried to quiet her. "We'll go to satisfy you." Her voice hardened. "I know. I was asleep. It woke me up, stealing in across the court again." Bobby grasped her arm. "You came out and aroused up at once." She shook her head. I couldn't find my dressing gown. This dress was by the bed. I put it on, but I couldn't seem to fasten it." Bobby stepped back, remembering his last thought before drifting into the trance-like sleep. She seemed to know what was in his mind. "But when I knocked, you were sleeping so soundly." "Too soundly, perhaps." "Come, we're growing imaginative," Graham said. "Howells will take care of himself. He'll probably give us a deuce for disturbing him. But to satisfy you, Katherine, we'll wake him up." "If you can," she whispered. They entered the main hall. Light came through the stairwell from the lower floor. Graham walked to the rail and glanced down. Bobby followed him. On the table by the fireplace the cards were arranged in neat piles. A strong draught blew cigarette smoke up to them. "Paredes," Graham said, amazed, "is still downstairs. The front door's open. He's probably in the court." "It must be very late," Bobby said. Katherine shivered. 2:30. I looked at my watch. The same time as last night." With a gesture of resolution she led the way into the corridor. Bobby shrank from the damp and musty atmosphere of the narrow passage. "Why do you come, Katherine?" he asked. "I have to know as I had to know last night." Graham raised his hand and knocked at the door, which again was locked on the inside. The echoes chattered back at them. Graham knocked again. With a passionate revolt Katherine raised her hands, too, and pounded at the panels. Suddenly she gave up. She let her hands fall listlessly. "It's no use." "Howells! Howells!" Graham called. "Why don't you answer?" "When he boasted tonight," Katherine whispered, "the murderer heard him." "Suppose he's gone down to the library," Graham said. Bobby gave Katherine the candle. "No, he'd have stayed. We've got to break in here. We've got to find out." Graham placed his powerful shoulder against the door. The lock strained. Bobby added his weight. With a splintering of wood the door flew open, precipitating them across the threshold. Through the darkness Graham sprang for the opposite door. "It's locked," he called, "and the key's on this side." Bobby took the candle from Katherine and forced himself to approach the bed. The flame flickered a little in the breeze which stole past the curtain of the open window. It shook across the body of Howells, fully clothed, with his head on the stained pillow. His face, intricately lined, was as peaceful as Silas Blackburn's had been. Its level smile persisted. Bobby caught his breath. Howells! He set the candle on the bureau. It's no use. We must look at the back of his head. The back of his head? Katherine echoed. It's illegal, Graham said. Look! Bobby cried. We've got to look! Graham tiptoed forward. He stretched out his hand. With a motion of abhorrence he drew it back. Bobby watched him hypnotically, thinking, I wanted this. I hated him. I thought of it just before I went to sleep. Graham reached out again. This time he touched Howell's head. It rolled over on the pillow. Good God! He said. They stared at the red hole near the base of the brain, at a fresh crimson splotch, straying beyond the edges of the darker one they had seen that afternoon. Graham turned away, his hand still outstretched, as if it had touched some poisonous thing and might retain a contamination. He was prepared against it, he whispered, expected it, yet it got him. He glanced rapidly around the room, whose shadows seemed crowding about the candle to stifle it. Unless we're all mad, he cried, the murderer must be hidden in this room now. Don't you see? He's got to be, or Groom's right and we're fighting the dead. Go out, Katherine. Stand by that broken door. Bobby, I'm going to look. End of Chapter 3. Recording by Ashley Jane.
Part 1 of Chapter 4 of The Abandoned Room. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading done by Jules Harlock of Mississauga, Ontario, Canada. The Abandoned Room by Wadsworth Camp. Chapter 4, Section 1. A strange light appears at the deserted house. Graham's intention, logical as it was, impressed Bobby as quite futile. Silas Blackburn had died in this ancient, melancholy room behind locked doors. This afternoon, with the repetition of the sounds that had probably accompanied his death, they had been drawn to find that, behind locked doors again, the position of the body had changed incredibly, as if to expose to them the tiny fatal wound at the base of the brain. Now, for the third time, those stealthy movements had aroused Katherine, and they had found, once more behind locked doors, the determined and malicious detective murdered precisely as old Blackburn had been. Of course, Graham was logical. By every rational argument, the murderer must still be in the room. Yet Bobby foresaw that, as always, no one would be found, that nothing would be unearthed to explain the succession of tragic mysteries. While Graham commenced his search, indeed, he continued to stare at the little round hole in Howell's head, at the fresh, irregular stain on the pillow, and he became absorbed in his own predicament. Again and again he asked himself if he could be responsible for these murders which had been committed with an inhuman ingenuity. He knew only that he had wandered, unconscious, in the vicinity of the Cedars last night, that he had been asleep when his grandfather's body had altered its position, that he had gone to sleep a little while ago too profoundly, brooding over Howell's challenge to the murderer to invade the room of death and kill him if he could. Howells had been confident that he could handle a man and so solve the riddle of how the room had been entered. Certainly Howell's challenge had been accepted, and Bobby knew that he had fallen into that deep sleep, hating the detective, telling himself that the man's death might save him from arrest, from conviction, from an intolerable walk to a little room with a single chair. Recurrent aphasia. The doctor's expression came back to him. In such a state, a man could overcome locked doors, could accomplish apparent miracles, and retain no recollection. And Bobby had hated and feared Howells more than he had his grandfather. Dully, he saw Katherine go out at Graham's direction. As one in a dream, he moved toward the door they had had to break down on entering. "Stand close to it," Graham said. "We'll cover everything." "You'll find no one," Bobby answered with a perfect assurance. He saw Graham take the candle and explore the large closets. He watched him examine the spaces behind the window curtains. He could smile a little as Graham stooped, peering beneath the bed, as he moved each piece of furniture large enough to secrete a man. "You see, Hartley, it's no use." Graham's lack of success, however, stimulated his anger. "Then," he said, "there must be some hiding place in the walls. Such devices are common in houses as old as this." Bobby indicated the silent form of the detective. "He believed I killed my grandfather. The only reason he didn't arrest me was his failure to find out how the room had been entered and left. Don't you suppose he looked for a hiding place or a secret entrance the first thing? It's obvious." But Graham's savage determination increased. He sounded each panel. None gave the slightest revealing response. He got a tape from Katherine and measured the dimensions of the room, the private hall, and the corridor. At last he turned to Bobby, his anger dead, his face white and tired. "Everything checks," he admitted. "There's no secret room, no way in or out. Logically, Groom's right. We're fighting the dead who resent the intrusion of your grandfather and Howells." He laughed mirthlessly. "After all, we can't surrender to that. There must be another answer." "From the first, Howells was satisfied with me," Bobby said. Graham flung up his hands. "Then tell me how you got in without disturbing those locks. I grant you, Bobby, you had sufficient motive for both murders. But I don't believe you have two personalities, one decent and lovable, the other cruel and cunning to the point of magic. I don't believe if a man had two such personalities, the actions of one would be totally closed to the memory of the other." Bobby smiled wanly. "It isn't pleasant to confess it, Hartley, but I have read of such cases." "Fiction." "Scientific fact." "I wish to the devil I had shared your room with you tonight," Graham muttered. "I might have furnished you an alibi for this affair at least." "Either that," Bobby answered frankly, "or you might have followed me and learned the whole secret. Honestly, isn't that what you're thinking of, Hartley? And I did go to sleep, telling myself it would help me if something of the sort happened to Howells. Now I'm not so sure that it will. I suppose you've got to notify the police." Graham held up his hand. "What's that in the corridor?" There were quiet footsteps in the corridor. Bobby turned quickly. Paredes strolled slowly through the passage, a cigarette held in his slender, listless fingers. Bobby stared at him, remembering his surprise a few minutes ago that the Panamanian should have sat up so late. Should have been, probably, in the court when they had followed Katherine to the discovery of this new crime. Paredes paused in the doorway. He took in the tragic picture framed by the sinister room without displaying the slightest interest. He continued to hold his cigarette until it expired. Then he crossed the threshold. Graham and Bobby watched the expressionless face. Gracefully, Paredes raised his finger and pointed to the bed. When he spoke, his voice was low and pleasant. "Appalling. I feared something of the kind when I heard you come to this room." He glanced at the broken door. "The same unbelievable circumstance," he drawled. "I see you had to break in." The color flashed back to Graham's face. "You have taken plenty of time to solve your misgivings." "It hasn't been so long." "I fancied everything was all right, and I was immersed in my solitaire." Then I heard a stirring upstairs. As I told you, the house frightens me. It is not natural or healthy, so I came up to investigate this stirring, and there was Miss Catherine in the hall. She told me." Graham faced him with undisguised enmity. "Immersed in your solitaire? We were attracted by a light in the lower hall at such an hour. We looked down. You were not there. The front door was open." Paredes glanced at his cold cigarette. He yawned. "When Howells died, precisely as Mr. Blackburn did," Graham hurried on, "you alone were awake about the house. Weren't you at that moment in the court?" Paredes laughed tolerantly. "It is clear, in spite of my apologies, that we are not friends, Graham. But, may I ask you, are you accusing me of this strange accident? I should like to know what you were doing in the court." "Perhaps," Paredes answered, "I was attracted there by the sounds that aroused Miss Catherine." Graham shook his head. "From her description, I doubt if those sounds would have been audible in the hall." "No matter," Paredes said. "I merely suggest that it's a case for Groom. His hint of a spiritual enmity may be saner than you think." Catherine appeared in the doorway. She had evidently overheard Paredes' comment, for she nodded. The determination in her eyes suggested that she had struggled with the situation during these last moments and had reached a definite conclusion. That quality was in her voice. "At least, Hartley," she said, "you must send for Dr. Groom before you notify the police." Graham waved his hand. "Why?" he asked. "The man is dead." With a movement hidden from Paredes, she indicated Bobby. "Last time there was a good deal of delay before the doctor came. If we get him right away, he may be able to do something for this poor fellow. At least his advice would be useful." Bobby realized that she was fighting for time for him. Any delay would be useful that would give them a chance to plan before the police with unimaginative efficiency should invade the house and limit their opportunities. Graham showed that he caught her point. "Maybe it's better," he said. "Then, Bobby, telephone Groom to be ready for you, and take my runabout. It's in the stable. You'll get him here much faster than he could come in his carriage." "While I'm gone," Bobby asked, "what will you do?" "Watch this room," Graham jerked out. "See that no one enters or leaves it, or touches the body. I'll hope for some clue." "You've plenty of courage," Paredes drawled. "I shouldn't care to watch alone in this room." He followed Catherine into the corridor. Bobby looked at Graham. "You'll take no chances, Hartley." Graham's smile wasn't pleasant. "According to you and the dead detective, there's no risk while you're out of the house. Still, I shall be nervous, but don't worry." Bobby joined the others before they had reached the hall. "Of course Hartley found nothing," Catherine said to him. "Nothing," Paredes answered, "except a very bad temper." Catherine's distaste for the man was no longer veiled. "You don't like Mr. Graham," she said, "but he is our friend, and he is in this house to help us." Paredes bowed. "I regret that the amusement Mr. Graham causes me sometimes finds expression. He is so earnest, so materialistic in his relation to the world. That is why he will see nothing psychic in the situation." Paredes' easy contempt was like a tonic for Catherine. Her fear seemed to drop from her. She turned purposefully to Bobby, ignoring the Panamanian. "I shall watch with Hartley," she said. He was ashamed that jealousy should creep into such a moment, but her resolve recalled his amorous discontent. The prospect of Graham and her watching alone, drawn to each other by their fright and uncertainty, by their surrounding, by the hour, became unbearable. It placed him to an extent on Paredes's side. It urged him, when Paredes had gone on downstairs to spring almost eagerly to his defense. "As Hartley says," Catherine began, "he makes you think of a snake. He must see we dislike and resent him." "You and Hartley, perhaps," Bobby said. "Carlos says he's here to help me. I've no reason to disbelieve him." A little colour came into Catherine's face. She half stretched out her hand as if in an appeal, but the colour faded and her hand dropped. "We are wasting time," she said. "You had better go." "I am sorry we disagree about Carlos," he commenced. She turned deliberately away from him. "You must hurry," she said. "Hurry!" He saw her enter the corridor to join Graham. The obscurity of the narrow place seemed to hold for him a new menace. He walked downstairs slowly, while he telephoned, instructing a servant to tell the doctor to be dressed and ready in 20 minutes. He saw Paredes go to the closet and get his hat and coat. "I shall keep you company," the Panamanian announced. Bobby was glad enough to have him. He didn't want to be alone. He was aware by this time that no amount of thought would persuade useful memories to emerge from the black pit. They walked to the stable, half gone to ruin like the rest of the estate. Bobby started Graham's car. The servants' quarters, he saw, were dark. Then Jenkins and the two women hadn't been aroused, were still ignorant of the new crime. As they drove smoothly past the gloomy house, they glimpsed through the court the dimly lit windows of the old room that persistently guarded its grim secret. Bobby pictured the living as well as the dead there, and his mind revolted and he shivered. He opened the throttle wider. The car sprang forward. The divergent glare from the headlights forced back the reluctant thickets. Paredes drawled unexpectedly, "There is nothing as lonely anywhere in the world." He stooped behind the windshield and lighted a cigarette. "At least, Bobby," he said between puffs, "the Cedars has taken from you the fear of Howells." And after a time, staring at the glow of his cigarette, he went on softly. "Have you noticed anything significant about the discovery of each mystery at the Cedars?" "Many things," Bobby muttered. "Think," Paredes urged him. Bobby answered angrily. "You've suggested that to me once today, Carlos. You mean that each time I've been asleep or unconscious?" "I mean something quite different," Paredes said. He hesitated. When he continued, his drawl was more pronounced. "Then you haven't remarked that each time it's been Miss Catherine who has made the discovery, who has aroused the rest of the house?" The car swerved sharply. Bobby's first impulse had been to take his hands from the wheel, to force Paredes to retract his sly insinuation. "That's the rottenest thing I've ever known you to do, Carlos. Take it back." Paredes shrugged his shoulders. "There is nothing to take back. I accuse no one. I merely call attention to a chain of exceptional coincidences." "You make me wonder," Bobby said, "if Hartley isn't justified in his dislike of you. You'll kill such a ridiculous suspicion." "Or," Paredes drawled, "very well. It seems my fate recently to offend those I like best. I merely thought that any theory leading away from you would be welcome." "Any theory," Bobby answered, "involving Catherine is unthinkable." Paredes smiled. "I didn't understand exactly how you felt. I rather took it for granted that Graham—" "Never mind, I take it back." "Then drop it," Bobby answered sullenly, sorry that there was nothing else he could say. They continued in silence through the deserted forest, whose aggressive loneliness made words seem trivial. Bobby was asking himself again where he had stood last night, when he had glimpsed for a moment the straining trees and the figure in the mask which he had called his conscience. If he could only prove that figure substantial, then Graham would have some ground for his suspicion of Paredes and the dancer Maria. He glanced at Paredes. Could there have been a conspiracy against him in the New York cafe? Did Paredes, in fact, have some devious purpose in remaining at the Cedars? The automobile took a sharp curve in the road. Bobby started, gazing ahead with an interest nearly hypnotic. The headlights had caught in their glare the deserted farmhouse in which he had awakened just before Howells had told him of his grandfather's death and practically placed him under arrest. In the white light, the frame of the house from which the paint had flaked appeared ghastly, unreal, like a structure seen in a nightmare from which one recoils with morbid horror. The light left the building. As the car tore past, Bobby could barely make out the black mass in the midst of the thicket. Paredes had observed it too. "I dare say," he remarked casually, "the Cedars will become as deserted as that. It is just that it should, for the entire neighborhood impresses one as unfriendly to life, as striving through death to drive life out." "Have you ever seen that house before?" Bobby asked quickly. "I have never seen it before. I do not care ever to see it again." It was a relief when the forest thinned and the fields stretched, flat and pleasant, like barriers against the stunted growth. Bobby stopped the car in front of one of a group of houses at the crossroads. He climbed the steps and rang. Dr. Groom opened the door himself. His gigantic, hairy figure was silhouetted against the light from within. "What's the matter now?" he demanded in his gruff voice. "Fortunately, I hadn't gone to bed. I was reading some books on psychic manifestations. Who's sick? Or—" Bobby's face must have told him a great deal, for he broke off. "Get your things on," Bobby said, "and I will tell you as we drive back, for you must come. Howells has been killed precisely as my grandfather was." For a moment Dr. Groom's bulky frame remained motionless in the doorway. Instead of the surprise and horror Bobby had foreseen, the old man expressed only a mute wonder. He got his hat and coat and entered the runabout. Paredes made room for him, sitting on the floor, his feet on the running board. Bobby had told all he knew before they had reached the forest. The doctor grunted then. "The wound at the back of the head was the same as in your grandfather's case?" "Exactly." "Then what good am I? Why am I routed out?" "A formality," Bobby answered. "Catherine thought if we got you quickly you might do something. Anyway, she wanted your advice." The woods closed about them. Again the light seemed to push back a palpable barrier. "I can't work miracles," the doctor was murmuring. "I can't bring men back to life. Such a wound leaves no ground for hope. You'd better have sent for the police at once. Hello!" He strained forward, peering around the windshield. "Funny," Paredes called. Bobby's eyes were on the road. "What do you see?" "The house, Bobby," Paredes cried. "No one, to my certain knowledge," the doctor said, "has lived in that house for 10 years. You say it was empty and falling to pieces when you woke up there this morning." Bobby knew what they meant then, and he reduced the speed of the car and looked ahead to the right. A pallid glow sifted through the trees from the direction of the deserted house. Bobby guided the car to the side of the road, stopped it, and shut off the engine. At first, no one moved. The three men stared as if in the presence of an unaccountable phenomenon. Even when Bobby had extinguished the headlights, the glow failed to brighten. Its pallid quality persisted. It seemed to radiate from a point close to the ground. "It comes from the front of the house," Bobby murmured. He stepped from the automobile. "What are you going to do?" Paredes wanted to know. "Find out who is in that house." For Bobby had experienced a quick hope. If there was a man or a woman secreted in the building, the truth as to his own remarkable presence there last night might not be so far to seek after all. There was, moreover, something lawless about this light escaping from the place at such an hour. A little while ago, when Paredes and he had driven past, the house had been black. They had remarked its lonely, abandoned appearance. It had led Paredes to speak of the neighborhood as the domain of death. Yet the strange, pallid quality of the light itself made him pause by the broken fence. It did come from the lower part of the front of the house, yet, so faint was it, it failed to outline the aperture through which it escaped. The doctor and Paredes joined him. "When I was here," he said, "all the shutters were closed. This glow is too white, too diffused. We must see." As he started forward, Paredes grasped his arm. "There are too many of us. We would make a noise. Suppose I creep up and investigate." "There is one way in, at the back," Bobby told the doctor. "Let us go there. We'll have whoever's inside trapped. Meantime, Carlos, if he wishes, will steal up to the front. He'll find out where the light comes from. He'll look in if he can." "That's the best plan," Paredes agreed. But they had scarcely turned the corner of the house, beyond reach of the glow, when Paredes rejoined them. His feet were no longer careful in the underbrush. He came up running. For the first time in their acquaintance, Bobby detected a lessening of the man's suave, unemotional habit. "The light," the Panamanian gasped. "It's gone. Before I could get close, it faded out." Bobby called to the doctor and ran toward the door at the rear. It was unhinged and half opened as it had been when he had awakened to his painful and inexplicable predicament. He went through, fumbling in his pockets for matches. The damp chill of the hall nauseated him as it had done before, seemed to place about his throat an intangible band that made breathing difficult. Before he could get his match safe the doctor had struck a wax vesta. Its strong flame played across the dingy, streaked walls. "There's a flashlight, Carlos," Bobby said, "in the door flap of the automobile." End of Chapter 4, Section 1 of The Abandoned Room.